What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for the DioField Chronicle, an interesting TRPG or SRPG that uses a real-time combat system. But to get all of my usual stuff out of the way right at the beginning, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube. And while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're not subscribed and go to my channel, first video you'll see is a video explaining everything. Also, my Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. Feel free to check it out. Now, another thing I need to mention at the beginning of the video here as well, I received a copy of this game via Square Enix for this review. However, I received it right before launch day, like literally noon the day before, and given my channel's focus on 100%, I never really try to make launch day reviews anyway, so here we are. But to be clear, I did receive this game for free from the publisher. Now, let's get to talking about the DioField Chronicle. As an overview, again, I would basically describe this as an SRPG with real-time with pause combat. The game itself tries to market this as a new sort of combat system, but I mean, honestly, it's just basically real-time with pause. So if you're familiar with that type of combat, you should be right at home here. But that said, the DioField Chronicle is a pretty easy game, which we're going to get into. You see, the game does have difficulty settings, casual, normal, and hard, but even on hard, you're probably going to find that the game is quite easy. And this is largely because a lot of things are heavily weighted in your favor, which we'll talk more about in the combat section, but I just wanted to mention it up front here. Now, let's talk about the plot setup and give kind of a general idea about the story. The game takes place on an island called DioField. On the mainland, an empire is conquering what is known of the world, basically. However, recently, a coalition of nations known as the Alliance has started putting up some resistance. The DioField, or the Kingdom of Alatain, which controls DioField, has up to this point largely stayed out of the conflict. However, DioField is very rich in jade. Jade is used for magic in this particular game. Modern magic consumes the jade, and thus they need a lot more of it. On DioField, they practice a type of magic called ancient sorcery, which actually does not destroy the jade, but rather uses it and lets it recharge. But because we are on a resource-rich island, obviously the conflict is going to come here sooner or later, and a lot of the game plays around with that specifically. Moreover, the Kingdom of Alatain is about to be in a succession crisis as the proven heir, if you will, dies before the game actually begins, so the kingdom is left with a dying king. And as you might imagine, that comes up. We ourselves play as a mercenary company known as the Blue Foxes. We join up with a kind of bigger mercenary group as the game opens and it evolves from there. Now, in terms of the story, I did want to mention a couple things, thoughts-wise, before we move on. Overall, I liked it. I don't think it's going to be super memorable for a lot of people, but overall, it was pretty good. The ending genuinely surprised me. Honestly, didn't see that coming. Like, I knew something weird was going on, but I didn't see that coming at all. A few other notes on the story before we move on, because there's no other place in this review they really fit. For starters, there's not a lot of interesting characters. There's a couple that you can clearly tell something more is going on with, and luckily, a lot of the story does revolve around those few interesting characters, but most of the characters you meet and interact with are kind of whatever. A lot of them don't have much of a personality, or they are very stoic and kind of give off very reserved responses, if you will. But some other stuff I wanted to mention as well is that the game doesn't really have anything that is missable. Once you get to a certain point in the story, you can actually replay old missions, which is how you can grind up levels if you need to, though the game is pretty easy, so I'm not really sure you're going to need to, but you can. If you say Mr. Reward or something, you can go back and get it. However, strangely, the game also has a New Game Plus, which I didn't really understand, because the New Game Plus is not scaled. You can literally just play through the same game again with maxed out characters and equipment if you want. However, as I just mentioned, that's kind of pointless because you can do that with the table in-game already. So the addition of the New Game Plus was kind of baffling to me, but it is here, I suppose. And in addition to replaying the missions, you even have an option to replay the cinematics once you get to a certain point in the story. So there just doesn't seem to be any reason at all to go through with New Game Plus, but it does exist. Now from here, let's talk about progression. But first up, let's talk about some of the characters we're going to get. Ultimately, all the characters you get are named people, so you're going to have set characters. That said, a few of them come and go, and you're going to wind up with, like, give or take around 15 to 16 at any given moment, once you get so far, of course, but you start with 3 and then you slowly ramp up to that number. But all of the characters are set. And furthermore, all of them occupy one of 4 archetypes. But collectively, all of these people make up your unit, which is where we're going to start talking about progression because there's a lot of systems at play here. So for starters, we have our unit rank. This is the overall rank of your unit, which is basically just how many missions you've done. You can kind of grind this up a little bit if you want, but without replaying anything, you're going to wind up about rank 9 just by playing through the story at a max of 10, so there's not really much of a point in grinding this. And you get benefits primarily in the form of SP, which is an ability thing we're going to talk about here in a second. But your unit rank is then divided up into 5 sub-ranks, which are badges. Badges have a rank of 1 to 5. They give you small benefits when you level them up, each of them a little different. Some of them are pretty obvious. There is a shop badge, which as you level that one up by doing side quests, which is the case for all of these by the way, you'll get access to more and more items in the shop. Some of these rank ups will happen naturally as you progress the story and thus aren't really missable, though by about halfway through the game you'll have already maxed out all of these if you're doing the side quests and advancing appropriately. Now all of these 5 badges are going to give us access to various things around our hub area, which will then help us progress in other things, primarily through the form of research. Research can be applied to weapons, orbs, and skills. Weapons are pretty straightforward. This allows you to develop a new weapon, which you then have to go buy from the store, which felt a little clunky. But these weapons are some of the best stuff you can find, primarily because they have better stats, obviously, but also because weapons determine your archetype's skills. So if a character can equip a type of weapon, it's the only type of weapon they can equip, and what weapon they have on is going to determine what skills they have in combat. So researching weapons is pretty important and requires a special resource to do so, namely these ingots. Then we have orbs. Orbs are your summons. These are kind of ridiculous because you get one of the best ones right out of the gate, which is Bahamut. These summons can be upgraded over the course of the game and can get very powerful. In fact, if you're just going for pure damage, you don't really get an upgrade to Bahamut until later in the game, especially if you spend the time to upgrade him. But ranking up the research badge will give you access to better and better versions of these summons that you can then upgrade and apply buffs to via Jade. You'll collect Jade on missions and you can spend it here along with gold to upgrade your summons. And that brings us to skills. Eventually, you will be able to max out every single skill in this game, but the research for the skills allows you to upgrade the skills for your characters. It does not grant new skills to your characters. As I said, that is done by weapons. However, the skills menu here will increase the effectiveness of said skills that you're using. Kind of important to note. But again, you will eventually, if you're doing everything, get more than enough to max out literally everything to do with skills. Skills use the resource SP, which is awarded through extra combat objectives, or upgrading your unit rank will usually also give you some for free. Now for the other types of upgrade materials, once you get to a certain point in the game, you can actually just straight up buy them from the shop. So you can grind missions for gold and then buy the resources to expand and research whatever you want once you get to a certain point in the story. So there's no like having to pick between one thing or the other. You will again be able to get everything because nothing is really missable. Now let's talk about our actual characters and their progression. Characters can of course level up, which will increase all of their stats a little bit, and each time they level up they get an AP point. You can spend this AP on pretty significant buffs to individual characters. These are actually somewhat unique and require a decent amount of AP to actually use, and these are basically the only thing that you cannot have active all the time. You can reset them and spend them on different things though, but these are huge buffs to the way that character plays or just straight up stat increases. So either way, you're pretty much good to go. These will make characters stronger as they level up, but honestly, you can kind of spend these however, because again, the game's pretty easy, though there are definitely some clear winners in some cases. And on top of all that, we of course have our equipment. Most of this is obvious. The weapon that character characters available to actually use, and then their accessories. Each character can have 2 accessories on. Accessories just provide flat buffs, usually in the form of an increase to one of your stats. Some special items in the game will, however, increase everything or potentially even give a passive effect. Now, in terms of the equipment progression though, all of it's very simple. At first, it kind of seems like you might have some options and kind of choose between something having one buff versus another, but once you get to a certain point in the game, it just doesn't matter, which means doing whatever gives you the most damage is usually the best way to go anyway. But as long as you're upgrading your weapon, the actual accessories and the choices therein just aren't going to matter much. But all of that brings us to the combat section. As I mentioned, the combat is real-time with pause meets TRPG, but it's very easy. And the game doesn't really do all that much that is unique, and in some cases it's actually a little clunky, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But the reason this combat system is so easy is because the enemies are at a huge disadvantage to you. You see, when you pause the game to use an ability, you use that ability while the game is paused, meaning that it just triggers that way. However, when an enemy uses an ability, they get a huge telegraph and you are free to move out of the way, which can pretty easily be done in most cases, or you can just straight up stun the character trying to use the ability, which ends their attempt to do so. And stuns are pretty plentiful in this game as well. And most enemies don't really have a good auto attack, which means they can't really do a lot of damage to you otherwise. So you are free to pretty much use whatever tactics necessary to just destroy an enemy. So even on hard mode, the game just isn't that difficult once you've figured it out. Now, the only thing kind of approaching much in the way of strategy that you really need to employ is the positioning of the enemies and you. Anything that gets hit in the back takes ambush damage, which is increased damage, of course. So this can make flanking something a pretty useful way to go, and obviously you don't want to get hit in the back either because of the increased damage. However, this is pretty easy to play around, because outside of a few missions where the enemies start charging you directly and move to attack you immediately, most enemies have a detection range, and this allows you to sneak up behind them and trigger that ambush damage as well. In fact, if you can one-shot enemies this way, which is very possible even on hard, you won't even trigger the detection of other enemies, which allows you to pick off multiple enemies before the fight even really starts by playing around with this detection radius as well as this ambush mechanic. And with the sort of main character of the game, really, Andreas, who most of the story revolves around, he gets an ability with his weapons, daggers, known as assassination. If you kill something with assassination, the cooldown is immediately reset, which allows you to just soften things up and then trigger assassination over and over and over again until you're out of EP. EP is the only limiting factor your characters are really going to have to deal with, because this is essentially what their resource is for using their skills. However, even this is relatively tame because there are multiple ways around this. Some characters have abilities that just regain this straight up. You can also find pink orbs on the actual combat map itself that will restore some of this, and it's just not difficult to manage it at all. Now, the only real exception to this are the boss enemies, and boss enemies are honestly still pretty easy. However, they get multiple health bars, and you cannot spam them with status effects. So whereas most enemies, I can just spam them with stun as much as I want, boss enemies, that will not work. You can only apply a status effect once per health bar, meaning that once that status effect expires, you cannot apply it to them again until that first health bar goes away. But honestly, that's not usually a huge deal to just play around, so something to keep in mind. Now, last but not least, I want to talk about yet another thing that kind of skews things in your favor, and that is the party size. While you might be looking at the screen here and thinking that it's just a 4-person party, that's kind of true, but also kind of not. You see, each of your 4 characters has a sort of secondary slot that you can assign another character to. And this will allow that character, when the game is paused in combat, to use the secondary character's abilities. Once you get to, I believe it's unit rank 3, you can actually just swap the characters in the middle of combat. So not only do you have the skills from the character you're using, but you have the skills from a secondary character that you can then back up and cover your weaknesses on, which is going to give you access to all sorts of status effects, and is one of the many reasons you can become so vastly overpowered compared to the enemy. So that brings us to kind of just my thoughts on combat here, and that is largely that the system is frankly too simple. I loved the idea. Most TRPGs or SRPGs use turn-based combat and it's very slow, whereas Real Time with Pause, as you might imagine, is much, much faster. In fact, some of these missions only take a couple minutes, and as a result, the game only winds up being like 20 or so hours. And honestly, just the concept of the positioning is a good one. The real issues here are that I don't think they took it far enough and they gave you a little too much power. I think what the game could have done to like make this a little better is honestly just make the enemies a little more challenging, have them capable of dealing a bit more damage and perhaps using abilities on you that aren't heavily telegraphed. Honestly, even just a slight fog of war would probably go a long way to preventing some of the nonsense you can really achieve on some of these combat missions. But my main gripe is that it's just too easy and they should have taken it a step farther in terms of what the enemy is capable of to kind of balance things out a little bit. But that said, that is pretty much everything we needed to cover on the DioField Chronicle, which brings us to positives, negatives, and the wrap-up. So on the positive side, very approachable TRPG, if you will. Again, it's very easy, which means if you're trying to get into this genre of game, this is a pretty good place to start because it's pretty solid. You won't really deal with any bugs or anything. There's a ton of quality of life features, and it's kind of easy to get the feel for this type of game, even if you're the kind of person who's not necessarily that good with Real Time with Pause. Very approachable title. Tons of quality of life features. The overall concept, while it could use some refining, is still really cool. A game like this with Real Time with Pause, I think, is great. I just think they need to tweak the combat a little bit to make it more of a challenge. Now, on the negative side of things, it's a little too easy. As I mentioned, they need to tweak things, at least on the higher difficulties, to make this more interesting to veterans, because the combat really kind of fails to do anything unique, which makes it a tough sell to veterans of the genre who aren't going to pick this over anything else necessarily, especially when we start looking at the price. Beyond that, the game itself feels a little bit clunky here and there. For instance, it's only about half voice acted. Most of the game is voice acted, and then you have conversations where the characters only say like an initial line, or they'll bark something out real quick that actually isn't what's being said, and then you'll have to read the text instead. So little things like that can feel a little clunky. Also, the actual controls on PC are also a little clunky. For instance, if you select your characters, it automatically pauses the game, which I don't think is necessary. So in a game that's really polished in some areas, to have these just like little weird nuanced things that don't work quite right is a strange thing. Also, as I mentioned, the game is pretty short. You can 100% this game in like under 25 hours. Now, some of that's down to the Real Time with Pause, so your mileage may vary there, but for me, very short game. Probably the most damning negative for me personally was that the entire game kind of felt like an experiment. It kind of felt like they were like, what can we do with Real Time with Pause here, that kind of thing. And because of that, as I mentioned, a lot of things feel like if they had just iterated on a couple of things, it could have been better than it was. And in many ways, this game feels like it's trying something for the first time that isn't that uncommon in other parts of this type of game. For instance, Real Time with Pause is quite a common thing in CRPGs. So seeing the sort of very easy implementation here is a strange thing. But nonetheless, the concept is very cool. And while I didn't really mention it anywhere else, the art style is gorgeous. I loved the art, especially the diorama battles, as well as the art for like the summons when you bring them in. Just very, very cool art style. But that, of course, brings us to our conclusion. This is a game with some good ideas, but ultimately lacks a bit of that AAA polish, which is a problem because the game is asking AAA money. This is a $60 game if you want to buy it right now, which in my opinion is just too much. If it had blown me out of the water, I would actually consider $60 maybe not being so bad, but as it stands, you can buy a lot of games like this that are turn-based instead of Real Time with Pause that are arguably just as good for much less money. And more than anything, this game just does not justify its $60 price tag. But that said, it's still a good game, and I think it has some interesting concepts that I think, if ironed out, could make for a really, really cool follow-up. Because honestly, I would love to see this system given a bit of iteration to see what more they could do for it. Because right now, they just didn't take it quite far enough. But again, some of the ideas at play here are very cool. And because of that, I think if you pick this game up on a sale, you would likely enjoy it a great deal. I hope Square Enix doesn't give up on some of the ideas at play here. With a little iteration, this could be really, really cool. But that's all I've got for you guys today. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.